Hi, I'm Chandler.
And I'm Izzy.
And welcome to
What in the World?
This podcast is brought to you by We Do, the Women's Environment and Development Organization, an international non-governmental organization based in New York City that advocates for women's equality and global policy. Thank you so much for your continued support of our project. For more information, feel free to visit their website, wedo.org.
We have also received sponsorship by the Borgen Project, a nonprofit that is working to make poverty a focus of U.S. foreign policy with a focus on environmental refugees. Thank you for supporting us and for all you do around the world.
Wow, there are so many great organizations out there. We can provide additional resources for you guys to check out on our webpage. So our podcast aims to address and uncover current events worldwide, seeking to bring clarity surrounding issues involving environmental and social injustices. In this episode, we're shedding light on the current social and environmental climate of sub-Saharan Africa.
We have researched the social inequities surrounding forced migration in relation to climate change. Chandler is an expert in gender studies, specifically studying female-headed households. I'm an environmental scientist currently researching the patterns of climate migrants due to the increased pressures of global warming.
Within this podcast, we're looking to create links between forced migration out of sub-Saharan Africa and the lasting effect the absence of males in the home is having. You will hear from other experts that we have worked with for our research, as well as personal stories from those we've interviewed along the way.
While there is strong research supporting both the migration patterns in relation to environmental change, as well as strong research around female-headed households due to labor migration, there's little data that ties the two together. It is our mission within this podcast to link the two issues and find a way to create solutions. I would like to start and talk about what I have seen and who I have worked with while researching this incredibly interesting topic. I'm currently studying environmental migrants. I've chosen this area of study due to the increasing pressures put on the global south as well as the rest of the world from the changing climate. Most people are just hearing this term or the term environmental refugees, as it is a way to categorize the influx of migrants that have been forced out of their homes by a worsening climate. Although environmental-driven migration has occurred for over 400,000 years, this is the first time the environmental change can be linked back to human impact. The climate crisis has already had a large impact on migration, as 17.2 million people have been already displaced around the world. And for my research, I specifically looked at those living in sub-Saharan Africa. I have tracked the movements and have received first-hand accounts to learn about the push and pull factors of this migration in the area.
Similar to Izzy's introduction, I think it's important to define gender inequality as a whole. The idea of gender inequality, as stated by author Kevin Grant, quote, acknowledges that men and women are not equal, and that gender affects an individual's lived experience. These differences arise from distinctions in biology, psychology, and cultural norms. Some of these distinctions are empirically grounded, while others appear to be socially constructed, end quote. I think that this definition really sheds light on the multitude of ways in which gender inequality can be seen through a variety of contexts in our day-to-day lives, and the ways in which these inequalities might spread across cultures. Within my research surrounding this topic, I specifically looked into female-headed households in sub-Saharan Africa, and the ways in which these households suffer in the absence of a male lead. As a gender studies expert, nothing pains me more than to admit that a man makes a significant difference in the well-being of a home. But so be it. In this case, I guess men are a good thing.
Well, you don't hear that every day. For our shared research, Chandler and I have spent time studying the movements in and around sub-Saharan African countries, and I've noticed a similar pattern regarding this new migration in the recent years. An article I found that supports our topic is titled, Has Climate Change Driven Urbanization in Africa? And the author and researcher Vernon Henderson speaks towards the links between climate change and urbanization regarding cities in sub-Saharan Africa. He has seen most families flee to urban areas, leaving their land and in search of a more concrete, secure life without having to rely on agriculture. This continent is highly dependent on natural resources and agriculture. And most of you know, agriculture is in turn heavily dependent on climate conditions. If we consider that about 60% of the population along the Sahel area is employed by rain-fed agriculture, it's easy to understand the potential devastating effects of environmental changes on this region. Seeing families that leave these resources due to the extreme conditions they are faced with is definitely shocking the rest of the world, especially in countries where they're dependent on the products and produce sourced in these countries. So Chandler, I've seen those who are the head of the household, specifically men, have become recently unemployed and in search of work in the States. What have you seen in terms of the new situation presented for these families left at home?
It's really interesting that you bring that up. I actually read an article called Labor Migration as a Social Security Mechanism for Smallholder Households in Sub-Saharan Africa. And in this article, we see that there is an increased number of men leaving Africa and heading to the States trying to find work. And this is something that we call labor migration. And when these men leave, they oftentimes send remittances or money back home, and it is given to the family or the wife or another head of the household. And so when men leave, sometimes they'll migrate temporarily in order to find a stable income, in order to send money home and things like that. But sometimes they'll invest in farming practices in the States, and that's more for long-term migration. And they see that as a type of investment for their future in terms of bringing their families out later to meet them. And so in terms of a new situation for these families, I would say that the biggest change is that the women are on their own. That's something that we don't see very often. And because there's no say as to when the men are going to come back, the women and the women-headed households are often more food insecure. And they're not accustomed to being the head of the household, so there's a lot of changes that need to occur. And in a study conducted by Cassie Manelli that was published in an article called What Determines Gender Inequality in Household Food Security in Kenya, she found that women produced more shareable crops, things like bananas and corn, things that could be shared among families and among other women whose husbands or partners had also left. But that the comparison to that was that when men were home, they were producing more cash-related crops, such as things like coffee and things that could be sold in the marketplace for money. And that's not necessarily the things that women are growing. They're growing things that they can eat and use in the moment. And so with the absence of men, women lack an abundance of resources. And the biggest one I think that they lack is access to land, because the land is technically under their husband's name and the husband has rights to it. And as we've seen in other cultures, women don't have all the rights that we have here in the States. And so she's not able to grow crops on her husband's land, let alone if she knows how to, because he's probably done it for the entirety of the time they've been together. And that's just never been a job that she's been allowed to take part in. So having access to land and fertilizer, farming technology, things like that, she is lacking access to, but also lacking access to water. As a single mom, it's less likely that you're able to just leave your kids at home. And so if she does, obviously that is of a concern, but her access to water is now limited as a single mother. But I think it's also important to note that these women are starting at a disadvantage. They were never taught to tend the land in the same way that the men were, and their society is very broken down by gender roles. And so I think that's really important to note, and also note that those are things I think we take for granted here in the States that's not necessarily the same across other cultures. But following the idea that the men might not be back in a specific period of time, Izzy, I was wondering if there are some environmental impacts that these women are going to have to begin to navigate that are specific to the geographies of Africa as climate change continues to worsen.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely seeing and studying the environmental impacts climate change has brought to Africa, it is clear that there is going to be a struggle to cope with the land that was once fertile and has been used and left by the male workers who have migrated out of the area. So definitely learning that the women have a drastic disadvantage when it comes to their work in agriculture. And from what you mentioned about the little knowledge about farming and being left with little to no rights for their resources, I can see how this becomes a major stressor for families living in rural communities. And to go back to your environmental impacts question, an example I saw that supports this idea is in Lake Chad, which borders Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon. And this is because it has shrunk by 90% since the 1960s. And this lake provided water for around 25 million people, and this provided for their livelihoods in agriculture, fisheries, and livestock. And due to the dramatic reduction of water levels, it has caused almost 7 million people to be food insecure. And because of this, thousands of men who were working in fisheries and farming have become unemployed in recent years. And this shows the movement of those who were once dependent on the natural land for their livelihoods. and helps us understand why so many workers have fled this region and left the women in charge of this land. I've also looked into the future of this type of migration in this area and have not been happy to hear about some of the predictions been made. For example, scholar Norman Myers argued that the current flow of migrants from Africa to Europe, quote, will surely come to be regarded as a trickle when compared to the floods that will ensue in decades ahead, end quote. I think Norman does a great job of addressing the future of environmental migration, as we're already seeing the dramatic numbers of those who are left behind, food insecure, and are displaced in Africa, as well as seeing those who have fled to more urban areas or even out of the country. So, with Chandler, with the idea that drought and other environmental changes will continue to affect these African communities, how do you think that will continue to affect women that have been left behind?
You know, a lot of research that we are looking into right now is pretty new. And so I'm curious if over time we'll see sort of an adaptation to the change in household structure. As we know, women are pretty resilient and adaptable. So I'm thinking maybe we could see some changes just in their ability to cope with the situation, possibly in some longitudinal studies. But in terms of how I think it will continue to affect women with your prediction of things worsening, I guess I would assume that women will soon need to leave Africa and possibly meet their husbands or partners in the States. With this said, I think it's interesting to think about the risks that come with being a climate migrant, a topic that an author, Nicole DeTross and Leah Windsor, address in detail in an article called Evaluating Climate Migration. And they cite, quote, employment, future income potential, marginalization, minority status, and education as specific concerns when looking at being a climate migrant. And in terms of gender, the authors discuss how the different migration populations hold different power dynamics when it comes to men and women. And I think those things need to be addressed when relocating into a different country, because the way that United States holds power dynamics between men and women is very different than how they might do it in Africa. And I think that those would be very hard things to understand and to normalize. But also I think looking at the jobs that are available to women compared to men in the States when becoming a climate migrant, I think it's very normalized for us that women can do anything, but I'm not sure that that is universal, especially in the minds of African women who have been denied so many rights. So I think the authors talked about how climate migrants who have already come over, the women are more likely to raise small animals, tend to smaller types of employment, while men lean towards more technical and formal forms of employment. And so I think that that is an interesting thing that we're already seeing, but also something that can continue to change as more migrants come over. But on a sadder note, the authors also address the harm that many women and girls face during their migration process, many of which are subject to various forms of sexual violence and sexual abuse. And so I think that this puts a special emphasis on the need to predict migration patterns and put policy into place to prepare for future outcomes and to prevent the poor outcomes. So Izzy, do you have any predictions about where migration patterns are heading and if policy can be put into place before that?
It is definitely hard to predict the future of environmental migration. And as we know, conditions are worsening in this area with increased weather events and as well as drought. An important thought that I'd like to mention, though, is that recently the UN Compact has officially recognized that climate change is a driver of migration for the first time in history. And for me, I think that this is a positive for this issue, as this means policy could be put into place for countries to be able to accept, recognize these migrants, address these migrants, as well as look back at those countries that were left behind in the future of their own development and what they can do for that. And I predict that there will be more media coverage on this issue, and hopefully with a new U.S. presidential leader in the coming years, there will be a possibility for more intervention and change among policy within U.S. borders. And having a leader that recognizes climate change will definitely be a step in the right direction in terms of migration and the future of these migrants.
Wow, that's huge that they've recognized migration as something that is the effect of climate change. I think the political climate can play a huge role in the patterns of migration that we see. and it'll be really interesting to see how things progress after the next presidential election.
Well, that's all the time we had for today. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this episode. We hope that our discussion prompted you to think about your stance on this issue and hopefully helped you to recognize the current inequalities that exist in this world. We have worked to link these two social and environmental issues together, but we are hopeful that more research will follow to continue to educate and discuss solutions to this issue. Thank you and see you next week.